Hello, everybody. A warm welcome from Berlin, as usual. Today, we are going to record our 60th video of AIOps Explained. So, hello, hooray! And of course, we're doing it together in a couple, as you know us, the dream team, Zane and Fred. And today, we're talking about the AIOps package, the latest release, and how you can connect an existing Netcool operations inside installation with the latest and greatest AIOps installation. Therefore, you need to set up two connectors if you want to talk to the object server to get events into your system, as well as if you want to trigger some policies in an impact server. Those are done via two connectors, and we're showing you today how to set up these connectors, how to configure them, what the best practices are. And speaking of best practices, we have Mr. Best Practice here in the call, which is Zane. And we have updated the best practices links here on the title page. So if you want to go into the AIOps Netcool video series, here's a link. And there's also an AIOps best practices released. Here's the link. And the well-known Netcool best practices also published here under this link. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Zane to say hello to you. Zane.
Good morning, Fred. Thanks for that. Yes, today we're talking about setting up the Netcool connectors. And the reason this is very, very important topic is that more than likely any AIOps deployment in the world is going to need some Netcool component. For example, someone will be deploying AIOps and they will realize one of their event sources is traps or syslog messages or something else for which we have a Netcool probe for. We have so many probes. They're fast, lightweight, reliable, and an excellent way of getting event data into AIOps. Also, most of our existing customer base will be likely retaining much of their Netcool investment as they move into AIOps for that very reason. Probes are there, they're receiving events reliably. If it's there and it's working, why would you change it? Not to mention that entitlement to Netcool comes with your AIOps licenses anyway. From the Netcool Impact point of view, many people use Impact for a variety of reasons. Where there's not an off-the-shelf automation or function that is provided by a product, Impact allows you the flexibility to create your own. So automation, integration, Impact is really the Swiss Army knife of tools. And usually you would see any deployment of AIOps using both of these components, Netcool Omnibus and Impact. And so knowing how to, set up these connectors is very, very important. Now, from a product point of view, it's actually not too difficult to actually create an instance of these connectors and set them up. However, there are a couple of gotchas that people can run into and often do, not because of the product itself, but more to do with other aspects of an environment, such as name resolution, as you'll see as we go through this. What we've done is we've put together this video and a blog to actually cover these topics and help people get up and running with these connectors quickly and avoid the common environmental issues that you might run into. So,
thank you, Zane. Today's agenda is like this. So we are going to talk through the two connectors that you will use. So there's for one, the object server connector, and for two, there's the impact connector. And we do have two different flavors of our product now. There's an OpenShift version, and there's also a Linux-based version, which doesn't have any OpenShift in it at all. So there are some differences, and we are going to cover these, what these bits and pieces are. Zane is going to show you the blog. He's going to demo the whole stuff on his live system. And I'm going to round it all up after his talkings with a short summary and the link to the documentation. That's what we want to do. And if you want to read the community blog, Zane has published a summary of all this content here in writing. Here's the link to it. So it's under the IBM community blog, and you will find it in the blog part of the AIOps products. Here it is. Have a read. Without further ado, I think we go into business. Zane, over to you. Demo time.
Okay. Thanks, Fred. Okay, so the first connector we're going to look at today is the IBM Netcool Operations Insight Object Server connector. Basically, what we'll do is we'll look at the configuration of each one, and then we take a look at, refer to the blog and cover off any gotchas. So this first page here is all about configuring the object server, right? The reason this is necessary is that when you have the object server connector hooked up to an object server instance, there is automation built in that will keep the events synchronized between the two systems. So when we change the state or status of an event in AIOps, it will flow back to Omnibus and vice versa. A couple of fields that you add to the object server in a trigger that enables the automation to flow back and forth between the two. So this is the first step. Next, we enter the details of the integration. So this includes the deployment options, the credentials for the object server, any filters you want to apply. So you might not necessarily want to bring all the events into AIOps. By default, it sets up a filter there. You can remove the filter altogether if you want everything, or adjust it to your needs. As you can see in my example, I'm filtering out self-monitoring alerts and connection watch alerts because I don't want to see those in AIOps. The next little toggle here is TLS enabled. If you're running your object server, if you're connecting to it using encryption, you can use that function if you want. And then finally, you put the details of the primary object server and the backup object server. We're going to cover off how this can be problematic in the backend, but you would test your connection like this, and as you can see in this particular case, it's failed. So we're going to talk about what the common problems are in this sort of scenario shortly. One of the things that we've skipped over at the top here is deployment options. So local versus remote. What does it mean? What this actually means is the location of the connector instance itself. So remote allows you to actually set up the running of the connector in a remote box, sort of separate from AIOps, right? There's some very sort of particular scenarios where this might need to be done, but in 99% of the time, you would want to install the connector locally within the AIOps cluster itself. That would be always the recommended. Finally, with the object server connector is the mapping. So the mapping basically defines how fields in Omnibus are mapped to attributes, event attributes in AIOps. It uses a JSON language, and when you create a new one, it comes out of the box with a sort of a default setup. You can customize it, and you can add, other fields and so on, and modify the behavior here. And really, that's all there is to it in terms of the setup from the AIOps side. But there are other aspects which you need to know about that are going on in the background that you may run into if you're having problems. Okay, now I'm going to switch over to the blog, and we'll take a look at the notes, which will help guide you through the setup process so that you can avoid any problems. So the first connector here talked about in the blog is the object server connector, and the first notes are about preparing your object server. This just refers to the code that's provided that you can inject into your object server to prepare it. As you can see, it's going to create two fields, the AIOps alert ID and the state variable, and these are used by the connection interactions to keep events synchronized. There's also a trigger here, which when the alert is closed in AIOps, it's deleted in Omnibus. This ensures that there are no race conditions. And then also there's a scope ID column, which is also used in the integration. Importing the SQL into your object server is just a case of using NCOSQL, as shown there. Right, this next section, ensuring a successful connection. This sort of few paragraphs here describes the IDUC process. So for those that are not familiar with it, Netcool Omnibus object servers have a system of update that when a gateway or a native event list connects to the object server on the primary port, those clients also make a secondary connection to the IDUC port. So IDUC stands for Insert, Delete, Update, and Control Information. And basically, events sitting in the object server are subject to constant change. So the system Omnibus has in place, many of you will know this, is the IDUC system, which once every granularity period of the object server sends out to all interested parties, gateways included, any inserts, deletes, updates, or control information that have occurred in that last granularity period. So by default, that's 60 seconds. And so that's what happens. Inside the Netcool connector is actually an embedded message bus gateway. So this is where this sort of applies, right? So the message bus gateway embedded within the connector is the thing that's connecting out to the remote object server. So as you can see here in the middle here, it describes the protocol for the handshake and the connection. So the gateway first reaches out to the host name and port specified in the connection process. So if we back up to this screen here, you can see this is where we're entering the host name and the port and the username and password in this screen here. Next, the object server negotiates the connection and provides its IDUC channel host name and port, right? So the object server actually tells the connecting client, this is my host name and this is the port. So in a default configuration, the object server will select an ephemeral port, randomly selected for IDUC. And during this connection protocol, it tells the connecting client, this is my IDUC port. Now, there is a way to fix that to a fixed value. And in scenarios where there's a firewall between AIOps and the object server, you would need to actually set that in the object server properties file to be a fixed port number. But anyway, if you don't do it, it just chooses an ephemeral port. So the third step in the connection process is the gateway then makes that second connection to the object server's IDUC port on the host name and port that the object server has given it. So this is where potentially people can run into problems. If they've set up a system for demonstration or test or demo purposes or evaluation purposes, then very often the Netcool server that the object server is running on is not in DNS. It's just a VM that they've spun up, installed Omnibus, and set up an object server, right? Because the IDUC connection process tells the connecting client, I'm running on this host name. If AIOps is not able to resolve this host name to the IP address, then the connection will fail. So we have to have some way of telling AIOps about who this host name is and the IP address. If we can do that, then when the object server responds with the host name and port number, then the connector or the gateway and embedded gateway will be able to successfully connect to the IDUC port, and the connection will succeed and everything's happy. Just to recap, this problem often comes up in sort of demo test evaluation environments where the Netcool server is not registered in DNS and the host name is not resolvable. So the next section of this blog post actually tells you how to update the pods running the Netcool connector with the host name IP address mapping that's needed for the connector to succeed. Basically, it's about adding an entry to your hosts file, your etc hosts file, in order to get it to work. If you're running on OpenShift, there's some instructions for doing that. Basically, you'll deploy the object server connector, then you will log into the GUI of OpenShift, edit the deployment, and add the additional host IP information into the YAML file directly. So there's instructions for doing that. And then there is a little section that tells you how to validate that it has worked correctly. Basically, you'll go to the pod running the connector, and you'll cat the etc hosts file, and you'll see that the entries added by host alias, you'll see it there. After you've done this, the pod will, well, after you've edited the deployment YAML file, the pod will actually restart. So wait for it to restart. Then you can go into the terminal and you can inspect the host file, and you'll see the additional entry added. You'll also see probably in the integrations file after a number of seconds, the connector report a successful connection, and you'll see the events starting to flow. So that's for OpenShift. If you're using the AIOps on Linux version, it's actually just a simple case of creating a config map and applying it to the system. This basically is what you need to use as a template. So this example here has my example Netcool server here with an IP address. So basically, it's adding an entry for the fully qualified domain name here, and also just the short host name as well, just to be on the safe side, to make sure that the pods running on AIOps on Linux have this information that it needs. So this is actually, on the Linux version, it actually updates the core DNS deployment, which is part of one of the pods that's running DNS services for the Linux-based version. So what we're doing is we're just simply appending it to that service. By virtue of doing that, all of the pods running on AIOps on Linux will be able to resolve this host. So it's not actually adding entries to the etc hosts. It's more augmenting the core DNS service on the Linux-based AIOps system so that it knows about this host and what its IP address is. So after you simply apply this config map, once you've sort of set it up to be correct for your needs, you can actually test it by SSHing into one of the pods, the connector pod, for example here, the ObjectServer connector pod, and trying to curl the Netcool hostname, as in this example. Now, of course, you can't curl to that host, but what you can see in the process of doing the test is that it's able to resolve the hostname to the IP address. And as you can see here, it's actually managing to do that now, whereas previously it wouldn't have. So deployment options, we spoke about this. Choose the local option unless you've got a very, very good reason to not. It's much easier to just deploy the connector inside the cluster for maintenance management and everything else. The final step here, setting up the mapping. This is a sample mapping that I've provided, which has a few sort of augmentations added. A couple of these I will talk about now. And in the notes underneath, it basically talks about some little tips about things that you can do and within your mapping file to gain extra value. So one of them is adding scope ID to your mapping under resource. If you map the scope ID from Omnibus, if you're setting scope ID, for example, in your probes or in a trigger perhaps in Omnibus, if you simply map it to the scope ID attribute in AIOps, it will automatically do scope-based grouping for you based on that. As it says in the notes, it doesn't preclude you from doing other scope-based grouping within AIOps, but it means that you can benefit from that work that you've done already. One of the points here is that certain attributes like severity in AIOps are mandatory. If you don't set severity, the event will be dropped. So it's really important to make sure that severity always has a value. This line is sort of augmented to make sure that's the case. Another couple of tips here. It's a good idea to map expire time and suppress escalate to AIOps, so these two lines here. And if you've set up some kind of housekeeping automation in Omnibus, all you have to do is map it to expiry seconds. AIOps actually includes out of the box an automation, an embedded automation that will clear events after expiry seconds of the last occurrence timestamp. So you can easily just benefit from that just by simply mapping your existing expire time field to the expiry seconds attribute, and it will do that automatically. Suppressed is another attribute in AIOps, and that can easily be done by mapping suppress escalate. So in this case, I'm saying if suppress escalate is 4, which means suppressed in Netcool Omnibus, then it's simply going to mark that as true. Otherwise, it will be false. If you've got any sort of suppression happening in Omnibus, perhaps you're using Impact, maintenance window manager to suppress events, then you can actually automatically benefit from that automation in AIOps as well. Quite convenient. And finally, this section here called the details. This is where you need to put all of your custom fields. All of your custom fields go into the details section. I've written another blog, if you look back in the blogs, about how you then use those custom fields in your views and so on. So that's easy enough, but this is where you would map them.
Zane?
Yeah, question?
Can't you add your own custom fields also to resource?
You can, but the convention is to add them to details.
Okay.
This is the recommended best practice by the developmental team, is to put all your custom fields in here. Now, there is a restriction at the time of writing. So the current version only supports string attributes in the details. This is going to be changed in future releases, but for 4.6.1 and I think 4.7.0 as well, you can only have string attributes in here. Now, from a usage point of view, it really doesn't make any difference whether I have an integer 5 value or a string 5 value, because you can still use it more or less in the same manner in AIOps. However, if you are setting an integer field in the details, you do need to cast it using this notation here. Otherwise, your connection will fail as well. So as I say, in future versions, this will be supporting all the types, but this is just a point in time statement. That brings us to the end of the object server connector. Hopefully you understand sort of the process by which the connector actually connects to the object server on both its primary port and the IDUC port, and understand how name server resolution can actually potentially cause issues. Fortunately, there's understood processes for circumventing this and resolving this simply by telling AIOps about these target hosts. Next, we're going to move on to the Impact connector. So the Impact connector is a single screen for its configuration. It's comprised of these elements here. So first thing you put in is the GUI server of the Impact endpoint, the backend API URL of Impact, the username, password, and Impact certificates. And then again, with the deployment options. So as I said before, local is the best choice in most circumstances. So let's take a look at these fields, and let's just go through a few sort of elements of common problems that people can potentially run into when setting this up. Jumping across to the blog again, specify the endpoints. A common problem that people make, and I've done this myself, is when I was first setting this up, I put the full URL of the Impact GUI into the box. So I put netcoolserver.abm.com 16311/IBM/console. That is not what it tells you to do. It actually says here in the instructions here what it needs, but it's a common problem that people make, is they'll accidentally put /IBM console on the end of the URL. It's actually looking for the endpoints, which is just the host name and the port. 16311 is the default GUI port for Impact. Often, if you're running the Impact GUI on the same server as a web GUI server, web GUI is using 16311, and quite often people will be using 17311 for Impact. So just check to make sure the port number is right. By default, it will be 16311. Similarly, the default backend API port on Impact is 9081. So unless you've changed that during the installation of Impact, that's what it'll be. That's the first thing. The next thing, enter the Impact server name, username and password. Impact admin is default, of course, and whatever password you've used when you set up Impact. The next section, SelfSign Certificates. If your Impact server has been set up with a kosher certificate issued by a recognized authority, you don't actually need to put anything in this box. However, this comes back to the common deployment scenario where people are doing demo, test, or evaluation, and they've set up an Impact, or they've set up a virtual machine, they've installed Impact, and they're doing some sort of testing and validation and demos and so on. In this case, Impact is more likely or not using a SelfSign certificate. In this case, you do need to add the SelfSign certificates into this box. Otherwise, the connection will fail. In the documentation, there's instructions for doing this. However, what I've done here is I've just boiled it down to some very simple steps. Basically, go to your Impact server and run this command. So here's a demonstration of it here. It's going to spit out, basically we're using the OpenSSL command to connect to the target, and in this case it's just hostname :16311 and echoing the certificate to the screen. So I'm running this on the same machine as Impact's running, so that it just resolves backquote hostname to the actual hostname. What you want to do is you want to copy everything between begin certificate, end certificate for both of these. As you can see, it's doing both the GUI server port and the backend API port one after the other. And you want to copy the whole lot, including the lines that say begin certificate, end certificate, as I've done here, right? So copy that, the whole thing, and then that goes into this box here. Impact certificates, SelfSign certificates only. So you can see here, I've copied that, I've pasted that in there. Final note on that one of the things that you do need to be careful of is that when you run this OpenSSL command, if I run that just plainly, right, you can see the full output. I'm not doing the command just to get the certificate. I'm actually looking at what the full output is. And what it's telling me here is actually more information. It talks about more details about the host, including the host name. So this is the name of my host that I'm running Impact on, the full host name. This is the host name that is matched to this certificate. Therefore, when I set up this connection in this hostname box here, I have to be using that fully qualified domain name that matches the certificate. If I don't use that fully qualified domain name, if I just use the host name instead, then it's not going to match the certificate and the connection will fail. When I'm setting this up, make sure you use the fully qualified domain name here that matches the certificate. If you do that, it will work. If you don't do it, it won't work. So that's really important, a really important thing. That URL matches the certificate that you've pasted into this box, because the fully qualified domain name is actually encoded into the certificate, and if they don't match, the connection will fail. Okay, and that brings us to the end of the blog. Hopefully this has been useful for you, and it provides you with everything you need to get up and running quickly with these two extremely valuable connectors and avoid common pitfalls that people can run into when setting these up. Back to you, Fred.
So thank you, Zane, for walking us through your demoing everything in your demo system environment. That was really insightful, and I really love the fact that we now have two versions, an OpenShift version as well as a Linux version. And I think you said that the Linux version, it is an early version, but it works really great. And setting up a demo environment or training environment is really the version to choose, because it's way quicker to set up. And that's something I really like.
Yeah, but like if you're just setting up a quick demo or evaluation environment, the requirement is simply a set of Linux VMs. So, you know, that's generally pretty easy for any organization to provision, versus having to set up storage and set up an OpenShift cluster first. So it's very convenient for evaluation, demo, and testing purposes. Yeah.
And it's faster. It's using local storage, for example. If you do have a cool M2 card, then it's really fast.
Yeah, we don't actually have any published benchmark testing on that yet, but I'm sure it will come in due course.
Yeah, well, let's see about that. Nevertheless, it's worth looking into, but still the Linux version is not a small or tiny version. It still requires quite some hardware, so it's not for free. But as soon as you have a system that matches the requirements, it's absolutely fantastic performance. So back to today's topic. So if you want to read about these connectors, there are lots and lots of connectors available. And today we just talked about the Impact connector and the ObjectServer connector. And the documentation link is here as shown on the screen. And it is in the latest and greatest release, which is 4.6.1. It is down here in defining integration, and then you go into Netcool integrations and you find these two connectors. So that's that. And of course, there's a big thank you for all of the audience for spending the time for us watching the 60th version, a 60th instance of our AIOps Explained videos. So thank you. And we are having a lot of attraction with this video series. So big thank you to all of you, and especially to you, Zane, for preparing all this stuff and making this video great. So thank you, everybody. And I'd like to see you in the next video. Bye.